Hello and welcome to David Starkey Talks in these sad days following the death of Queen Elizabeth II. They're of course days of mourning, but they're also days, or at least one day, of rejoicing for the accession of the new king, her son, the former Prince of Wales, now His Majesty King Charles III. As many of you will know, I hope, I'm covering these extraordinary events, because they are extraordinary, for the first time, of course, in the 70 years since the Queen's accession, when, to give a very simple measure of time, I was a boy of 7 in very short trousers watching the thing of her accession and her coronation. This strange period of mixture, as I said, rejoicing and sadness. The Queen is dead. Long live the King. As many of you will know, I hope, I am covering the day-to-day course of events on GB News. But what I thought I would do, when I have a little moment as now, is to reflect in rather more detail on, especially if you like, the constitutional significance, the novelty, if there is any, of events. The events themselves, of course, are profoundly rooted in tradition. Indeed, when you just look at them as they take place, they probably seem like an enaction. Let's get that word. An enaction of something out of Lewis Carroll with walking playing cards and so on. But actually, there is much more to it than that. And I've been struck so far, actually, at the amount of novelty. Let's begin with the accession, the ceremony, the accession council, which took place yesterday, which took place, that's to say, on Saturday, the first day of Operation London Bridge. As it happened, there was a delayed start to it because of the Queen's death, about as far away as it could be from London and Westminster at Balmoral. But yesterday, the new king was acknowledged. His accession was acknowledged by a special meeting of the Privy Council called the Accession Council, and his accession, after he had performed certain oaths and made in effect a contract. We'll talk about that at great length. It made in effect a contract with us, the realm, as subjects, as represented by those 200 privy councillors there. He was then proclaimed, first in the old way, the old style, by Garter King of Arms, first from the battlements, the kind of terrace, the elevated terrace or balcony overlooking Friary Court of St James's Palace, the seat, of course, in theory of the royal court, the court of St James's, and then again, that's Westminster, the royal capital, one of the 2 cities that make up the capital, and then again at the Royal Exchange, founded in the reign of Elizabeth II's great predecessor, Elizabeth I, in the heart of the City of London. Double process of accession, contract, pledging, mutual pledging, and then proclamation. The Accession Council takes us way, way back into our history. There've been romances about it being, going back to the Anglo-Saxon Wittengemot and all this kind of thing. Actually, I think it makes much more sense to start it about halfway through the process with the extinction of the House of Tudor, with the death in 1603 of the great Elizabeth. I'm sorry, I do say that, Elizabeth I, a monarch, the real ruler, not just, however impressive, the constitutional monarch like Elizabeth II, with the death of Elizabeth I, without a direct heir in 1603, and the succession of James VI of Scotland, who becomes James I of England. Now, why does this represent a very important moment? It represents an important moment because James, in theory, had never been, well, not in theory, in practice as well, had never actually been acknowledged as Elizabeth's heir. He desperately wanted to be, and there'd been extensive negotiations, which of course the Queen knew about, between the King of Scots and the leading members of Elizabeth's Privy Council. Much more about that in a moment, including Robert Cecil on the one hand, the Royal Secretary, and on the other hand, the Queen's favourite, Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, who of course had finally rebelled against the Queen and been executed. So both sides, both elements in the council, two bitterly rival factions, had both been negotiating with the King of Scots. So in one sense, it was a done deal. But it was a deeply doubtful legality. This is because still on the statute book, there was the Act of Parliament which enabled Henry VIII to leave the crown by his will properly signed and his will properly witnessed. And what that will had done, duly executed, though certainly signed not actually with the King's hand at that stage, but with what was known as the wet stamp of his signature, which is an extraordinary device for making a facsimile signature. You've got a raised block of the King's signature, which is screwed into the surface of the paper, then of course paper thick, heavy rag paper, and it leaves a sufficient impression that a skilled clerk, was actually called clerk, a skilled clerk could actually run his pen over in the indentation and give you a pretty well perfect replica of the King's signature. What had the will done in terms of the succession? Well, as we all know, it had left it crucially in succession, in series, to Henry's three children, first to Edward, then if he had no heirs, to Mary, and then if she had no heirs, to Elizabeth. It must have seemed infinitely unlikely when it was done that Elizabeth would actually succeed, but because Edward died without an heir, and Mary, although she'd persuaded herself at least twice that she was carrying children, Mary died without an heir, dreaming of the children that she'd never had. Elizabeth in turn succeeds, but then she dies without an heir. Well, Henry had envisaged that too, and he had left the crown to the successors of the heirs and successors of his younger sister, the Princess Mary, who had married Charles Brandon. And there were no children from that marriage, and no sons survive of that marriage, but there is a daughter, Frances, and she marries Henry Grey, the Marquis of Dorset. Now, the Greys were also quasi-royal because they were a product of Elizabeth Woodville's first marriage. She was the Queen of Edward IV, so they were of the sort of half-blood of the House of York. The couple, in due course, succeed to the Dukedom of Suffolk, and they have daughters, the most famous of whom is Jane Grey. We all know Jane Grey is the 13 Days Queen, I think I've got that one right, who succeeds to the throne after the death of Prince Edward without children. Now that, of course, broke Henry's will, because Henry quite clearly had said that if Edward dies without an heir, then Mary must succeed. Well, Mary does succeed by triumphant assertion of will. She raises troops, she leads troops in East Anglia from Framlingham. She defeats the forces sent against her, and when there's a challenge after a few months to her reign from the revolt of Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, which actually it's the only Tudor revolt actually to get right to London itself. She again, standing at the hustings, the actual platform from which the citizens of London competed for the vote when they were standing to be a common councillor or an alderman in the Guildhall. You can still see the place. She wins over the citizens. But of course, the fact that the House of Grey had been participants in the usurpation of the throne, of course, condemns them in the eyes of Mary, but it also condemns them in the eyes of Elizabeth, because Elizabeth, again, had been shunted aside by the accession, very brief accession, the very brief reign of Jane Grey, and Elizabeth never forgives that family. So when she becomes queen, she's absolutely determined that under no circumstances will the succession go to them. And it's dealt with very simply. As so many things are under Elizabeth, there's no grand repeal in Parliament. There's no formal attempt at undoing Henry's will. Instead, Henry's will is solemnly dug out of its chest, looked at again very solemnly by the council, then put back into its box, its chest, its seals, and locked up. And effectively, the key is thrown away. And this clause giving the succession to the Grey family is forgotten. Why has it gone to the younger sister? Why has it gone to the successors of Mary? It had, because Henry's elder sister, Margaret, had married out of the realms. I'm sure we all know she'd married King James IV of Scotland, and that was held by Henry to mean that her children could not claim, and her successors could not claim, the throne of England. And also, of course, there was the fact that by the time Henry died, England and Scotland were at war, and Scotland remained Catholic. So there was determination to exclude the Scottish line. But despite the fact that relations between Elizabeth and her cousin, that's the Mary Queen of Scots, she is the granddaughter of Margaret, despite the fact that relations between the two cousins are as appalling as they are, that Mary comes to England as a refugee from Scotland, very quickly turns herself into the symbolic head of Catholic reaction in England, and increasingly plots and conspires against the Queen and is finally executed. Nevertheless, of course, she had left her son, James VI of Scotland, and clearly Elizabeth, by repeated hints, wanted that he would be her successor. But he's extra legal. What that means then, when she dies in 1603, was that for a moment, for a time, the crown is actually in suspense. There is no acknowledged heir. There couldn't be that great proclamation. The Queen is, we've just heard, the Queen is dead, long live the King. That couldn't happen. So what happens to the sovereignty? What happens to England? Well, although it's never formally acknowledged, there is in fact an interregnum. Well, into whose hands does power lapse during the interregnum? Well, it lapses into the hands of the body which had governed England, the body which had governed England ever since the end of the reign of Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, the Privy Council. The Privy Council, it appears in many different guises in the reign of Henry VIII, but it's given its definitive shape, it's given its own clerk, it's given its own minute book, its own council book, its own act book, after the death of the King's great minister, Thomas Cromwell, the execution of his great minister, Thomas Cromwell, in 1540. And the broad composition of the council is also laid down by an act of Parliament, the Act of Parliament of 1539, which establishes, following the Reformation, when of course as it were, the existing status of offices is thrown right up in the air. Most of the important officers of state in the Middle Ages had actually been churchmen. All the, what you can call the clerical offices, the Lord Chancellor, the Lord Privy Seal, the secretaries, had been churchmen, the literate class. Only the other offices, like the Lord Chamberlain and the Lord Steward of the Household and the Admiral, the Earl Marshal and so on, had been held, generally speaking, by the titled nobility. And the Act of Precedents of 1539 sorts out the new order of precedence on the assumption that most of these the real great offices of state will actually be held by laymen. It also reorganises the seating pattern in Parliament to establish the fact that Henry is now equal equally head of both church and state, and the archbishops of York and Canterbury, which in the Middle Ages actually sit there up on the dais, only one step down from the king, and flanking him on either side, the Archbishop of Canterbury on his right, the Archbishop of York on his left. They come down, and they go down and they join the peers below him. So the king elevated over both church and state. All that by the Act of Precedents. And that Act of Precedents, by the way, accounts for whom we saw performing at the Accession Council. You saw somebody who is actually the leader of the House of Commons, but that's not an office known in formal terms of the Constitution. Instead, she holds the office of, well, three guesses what? Lord President of the Council. That's one of the senior offices recorded in the Act of Precedents of 1539. And interestingly enough, the office was actually created in the 1520s for somebody that we've already heard of. It's created for Charles Brandon, who is the grandfather of Lady Jane Grey and the father of Francis Brandon, who marries Henry Grey, Marquis of Dorset, and later Duke of Suffolk. So in other words, all those details of the reign of Henry VIII played themselves out. Again, who was part of the platform party? Well, the Lord Chancellor. Again, one of those offices mentioned in the Act of Precedents of 1539, as was the Earl Marshal, as was the Lord Great Chamberlain. So there is, as we saw on the platform party, the old Privy Council, the Privy Council of the 1540s. But interestingly, in 1603, that Privy Council, although it was the real power managed at this stage by Robert Cecil, who had succeeded his father, William Cecil, as the king's principal minister, although the council is managed by Robert Cecil, although he'd been doing the detailed negotiation with James, who was actually just practically ready, booted and spurred to come down to England, the Privy Council differs at that point. As I said, somebody has got to be found to represent the body of England between the dead Queen and the yet-to-be-acknowledged King of Scots, who isn't formally the heir. And what he reverts to, what the sovereignty reverts to, is the collective peerage. So that's why you have an accession council then. It's a kind of hyphen between the death of Elizabeth and the arrival of James in London and his proclamation and accession in London. It is to cover a very special set of circumstances. But the real element, and that, as I said, was most of the playing card element that we saw there. But there's one very interesting point. Although James was, as it were, an illegal or quasi-legal successor, he was successor in blood, undoubtedly, in hereditary right through Margaret Tudor. He's not successor in strict legal right, as had been determined by Act of Parliament, which I think is one of the reasons that the Stuarts place such immense emphasis on divine right and blood right succession. But interestingly, despite the fact, if you like, that the English had James at their mercy, they don't enter into a formal contract with him. He succeeds in theory and in practice to the entire powers of the English monarchy. Now, that shifts by the end of the 17th century because of the behaviour of James's descendants, two of whom, of course, are known as Charles, his son, Charles I, executed for the defiance of both the religious and the political conventions of the English. And then the grandson, Charles II, welcomed back in the Restoration, but always uneasy on the throne. And then finally, Charles, leaving lots and lots of children, but all of them illegitimate and no legitimate issue, and the crown going to his brother, James II, the Duke of York, who was Catholic. and again defies even more flamboyantly than his father, Charles I, the conventions of the English state in terms of both religion and politics, and as a result is driven from the throne in 1688, and in 1689 William and Mary, that's James's daughter, that's Mary, his daughter, by his first marriage to Anne Hyde, and there'd also been a sister, Anne, who likewise will succeed to the throne. They've been brought up as Protestants. They repudiate their father, and then Mary had been married off to another descendant of the House of Stuart through the line of the Princess Elizabeth, James's eldest daughter, who had married who had married the Elector Palatine and had briefly been Queen of Bohemia, the Winter Queen, and from that marriage, there is the descent from there into the royal house of, not royal, the princely house of Orange, who were the stadtholders of the Netherlands, which is what William was. So William and Mary, both with strong blood connections to England, succeed in 1689. But then Parliament, or rather the Convention, because only a king could actually summon a Parliament, and with the flight into exile, the driving into exile of James II, there wasn't a king. At that point, in 1689, the Convention does what it had not done, what the equivalent body had not done in 1603, what hadn't even been done in the aftermath of Magna Carta, when the rebel barons had summoned Prince Louis of France to be king in England. They hadn't actually at that point demanded that he agreed to the Charter. They didn't. Their successors in 1603 don't formally demand James's, as it were, accession to James's acknowledgement of the very different patterns of power in England, but in 1689 they do. The monarchy becomes conditional. And what we saw in the Accession Council was this fact, that the monarchy has actually become conditional. It is, as it were, it is an actual contract. And there were two elements very clearly in that contract that we saw. We saw how the King Charles, had to make, and clearly did so voluntarily, had to make an acknowledgement, had to enter into a formal oath to protect the religious settlement in Scotland, the position of the Scottish Presbyterian Church as the national church of Scotland, and indeed to become a member of that church when he goes north of the border. That was implicit in the settlement of it was implicit in the settlement of 1689, but it only, as it were, becomes of general application with the union of the crowns, the parliamentary union of the crowns of England and Scotland in 1707. So we see there the element of contract and also the very special status. This is something else that I want to talk about. The very special status of Scotland following that Act of Union of 1707. There's much nonsense about Scotland, having been colonised or overrun by the English. But in fact, Scotland in 1707 retains all the elements of a separate state, a separate nation, apart from a separate parliament. It retains, what we've just seen, a very different and very distinct church without bishops, without the lavish rituals and music and quasi-Catholic traditions of the Church of England. A very different church. It retains an entirely different educational system. It retains a different legal system. It retains a distinct currency. It retains a different royal court, a different order of chivalry, the order of the thistle, different heraldry presided over not by Garter, King of Arms, who's the chap who makes the proclamations as we saw, that's in England, but actually Lion, King of Arms in Scotland. So that extraordinary difference represented at the moment of accession by King Charles's formal the reading out, the signing of the declaration relating to the preservation of the status of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. All of that is in accordance with the pattern strictly laid down in 1689 and further developed by the Act of Union of 1707, which again is part of the same purpose of continuing to enforce the Protestant succession in both England and in Scotland. But there was all that established then, but it's part of this idea of the state existing apart from the monarch. The state is embodied in its high officers, in the Privy Council and the peerage, as having a continuous existence as a corporate entity, as a nation, as a state, as a crown, as a kingdom, even though there's no actual monarch. But there was a new element in the contract, and that really astonished me and surprised me, and we should have actually paid much more attention to it than we did. Did you hear those statements? I agree to surrender the Crown estates in return for the sovereign grant. Now, the Crown estates been surrendered, in fact. That's the old estates, really, of the Tudors and the medieval monarchs, or what was left of them. They had been surrendered under George III in the late 18th century, the reason being, very simply, that in theory, the monarch was supposed to maintain the ordinary peacetime administration of the country out of the Crown estates, out of the customs revenues and so on, and only use parliamentary taxation for war. In practice, by the late 18th century, it was impossible to do that, and government was already too big, too expensive, too complicated. So George III surrenders the Crown estates in return for what's called the civil list, which covers both the costs of the royal household and the expenses of day-to-day government. But of course, the element that covers the cost of the royal household has become increasingly controversial. The idea was, in the days when the pound was rock solid, that you could negotiate a settlement at the beginning of the reign, and that would be that. And for much of the time, that was that, because the pound was so rock solid. But of course, oh dear, in the later 20th century, inflation and the crashing pound, as well as the general sense that monarchy may be a bit of an extravagance that we can't really afford, and that the Queen is the late Queen, the nonsense that she was the richest woman in the world, and so on and so on. It made the fact that the civil list had constantly to be renegotiated, it made it a matter of profound controversy. Prince Charles was instrumental in replacing that negotiation with the idea of a fixed percentage of the yield of the Crown estate. The Crown estate, of course, principally in London, Regent Street, Regent's Park, an enormously valuable collection of lands there, yielding an income of hundreds of millions a year. Charles came up, and his advisors came up with the idea that let's have a fixed percentage of that, which of course will in a sense will be index linked, for the simple reason that the revenues from the lands will, broadly speaking, go, and the well-managed lands, the very sharply managed properties, will go up at least at the level of inflation. So you can see there, I think, Charles very, very much heading off, drawing on the experience of his mother's reign, and particularly the Annus Horribilis and all the rest of it, drawing on that and saying, right, I'm going to have a bit of a different settlement when I'm king. The other element, and again an element of genuine novelty, was you heard, the grandiose language after the king had entered into that double contract, the grandiose language that may he be pleased to order the issuing of orders to the Lord Chancellor to apply the Great Seal to a series of proclamations, in St James's, at the Royal Exchange, and then in Edinburgh, in the Tower of London, and then in Edinburgh, and in Cardiff and in Belfast and so on. Yes, all that sort of okay. But do you know what? There is real novelty there. Because not only are those proclamations going to be made, Charles is actually going to go there in person. He is going to go to Edinburgh. He is going to go to Cardiff. He is going to go to Belfast. And when he's there, what's he going to do? He is actually going to meet not just local dignitaries. He is going to meet the leaders of the devolved assemblies, the Scottish Parliament, Nicola Sturgeon, the Senedd in Wales, and the Northern Ireland Assembly in Stormont. In other words, this is the acknowledgement. No one has really spotted it. It's the Crown, in the person of the new King Charles III, actually taking over the devolution settlement and saying, well, actually, we are the unifier. And in other words, Charles really, I think, and some of the glum expressions of Nicola Sturgeon may represent this fact, that Charles has already, rather preempted things. And he has entered into a direct relationship with the Scottish Parliament as king. In other words, even if Nicola Sturgeon persists with the referendum for independence, even if she wins it, despite this extraordinary sense of the, if you like, the reunification of Britain, what? There'll be a king. There'll be a King of Scots. There'll be Charles. By the way, he's also Charles III as King of Scotland, in just as much as he's Charles III, King of England. Now, this seems very sensible. This seems tactful, subtle, intelligent. But there is a problem. That, if it happens, if devolution translates itself into home rule and even independence for Scotland, for Wales, for Northern Ireland, and therefore by default for England, that actually means that the only union of Great Britain will be a union of the crowns, just as it was in 1603 under James VI and James I. That is extraordinarily problematic. Relations between England and Scotland were at the worst in the 17th century when the crowns were united, but the Parliament wasn't. We fought at least twice. Bitter, bitter battles, to say nothing, of course, of the catastrophe of Cromwell in Ireland and so on. And even more to the point, Charles, if that happens, Charles as the King of Great Britain and Prince, Wales would be even more, wouldn't it? Because presumably William would enjoy some sort of quasi-sovereignty were there Welsh independence. And Charles as King of Northern Ireland, King of Scotland, King of England, and a kind very much sounds Habsburg, doesn't it? And William as Prince of Wales, their role as the unifier, the sole unifier of Britain, would be one without advice. It would be very much like the Queen's role as head of the Commonwealth. And I wonder, really, if that is actually a good idea, especially when the new head, the crown unifier of Great Britain, would be the rather untested, but we hope for the best, King Charles III of quite what? I've now raised the question. So all of that was implicit in the Accession Council. Underneath the flummery, there was substance, and I think there was iron will, foresight, and determination, which, do you know what, can only have come from King Charles III himself. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.